The secular world has a view of life that is very, very cheap. Very cheap. They believe that if they can find the ingredients that make up your body, carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, etc., there's 8 of them, and some of the trace elements, if they can get that ingredients and they can create the right environment, liquid water, I need a clement atmosphere, etc. If you can get those things, then in fact life will inevitably arise out of the ingredients. So they view life as the result of baking a cake. They went and they get the parts, they have the oven, it's turned on for so many hours, whatever, at whatever temperature, and eventually you get a cake. I'm here to tell you that is not where life comes from. Life is a gift from God. God used similar materials to house the life that he created. But the houses don't make the life. And so we have a serious problem there. Again, you cannot reconcile these two stories of where we come from. Now, examples of these are jellyfish, nautilus, horseshoe crabs, coelacanth, and many more. So the more famous example is this coelacanth. Was found in 1938 off the coast of Africa, South Africa specifically. It's a very large fish. It's ugly and it's mean, so you don't want to mess with it. But it's very large, like this. Okay, big fish, 70 pounds probably. So they pull this up, and this is a major embarrassment. They hide it from the scientific world to see if there's any way they can come up with a different story, and they hide it for many months. But eventually it comes out. And the reason that it's a real problem is the coelacanth was extinct. And it was in the line of succession from fish to land animal. And they had the coelacanth, they had those fins all becoming legs. The books were published, they were already teaching it. And then God had a sense of humor and let them find one that was still alive. It's called a living fossil. There are hundreds of living fossils. Hundreds. They're not extinct. This is a horseshoe crab. That's what one looks like alive. This is one that looks like, that they tell me, is just under 300 million years old. I own that one on the left. It's worth a ton of money if anybody wants to buy it. It's a joke. It's a nautilus. This is what it looks like without the living member. And so at the end of the day, they've come up with 3 kinds of evolution: convergent, divergent, and independent. And so the idea here is that if 2 things develop the same appendage, like a bird gets a wing, but a cat gets a paw. Those are both the same morphology. And the idea that, that they can explain that. If for some reason 2 life forms converge on the same point, that's actually called a divergent evolution. And then you've got a third kind, which they say is rare. I'm going to tell you they're all rare. But then you've got convergent evolution of echolocation. So they believe that nature independently created the mechanism for biosonar in whales. By the way, it's only odonteat whales. It's only whales with teeth that have that, and the bats. And bats are a great study in this. So this is about, the ancient bacterial. This is a huge mess today, huge mess. So there's a bunch of people in the secular world looking to make their own Jurassic Park. And theoretically, they're finding bacteria in fossils that are supposed to be 250 million years old. Now the bacteria, DNA, we're pretty sure can't possibly exist past maybe 10,000 years. That's it. So it's really a difficult problem where this is coming from. And The other problem is they're using DNA that hasn't been fixated in a population in many, many years. This is probably really bad science. We don't know what we don't know, and they're starting to mess with that stuff. World population growth. We have about 8 billion people on the planet. It's not going to be very long before we have 10 billion. If you make reasonable assumptions for fertility rates, length of a generation, mortality, plagues, wars, all of those kinds of things, if you follow the biblical model, you're going to end up right about where we are. Now, if you don't follow the biblical model, and man's been around for a couple of 100 million years, you have to ask yourself, where are all the bodies? Right? We've got bodies of everything else that dies. Where are they? No, probably not. Okay, but what I'm telling you is world population fits into the time frames we're talking about, roughly. Dr. John Sanford, he was head of biology at Cornell. He's an exceptional man. He designed most of the genetic machinery, and certainly the machine on the right there. He came up with something called the Mendel's accountant. The idea of George Mendel, the geneticist, he actually went back and counted the mutations. He specialized in mitochondrial DNA. So I don't want to sound sexist, but when you get to cell walls, mitochondria, ribosomes, endoplasmic reticula, when you get to all the things that make a cell, it has no Y chromosomes. That means us guys, we had nothing to do with it. That means mom passes the cell wall structures and all of those organelles. That stuff all comes right from mom. It's kind of important because today, if you're going to be a Jew, the law is your mother has to be a Jew. If your mother isn't 51% Jewish, you're not Jewish. You can't be admitted into Israel as a Jew. And let's go back to the Old Testament. When God said that the people had polluted themselves by marrying outside of the people, who did he hold accountable? The men. Who did he kick out? The women. Because their offspring are not Jews. So God did that on purpose, and the point here is mitochondrial DNA is only in the female. Well, that allows us to look at populations and understand the female. So it turns out mothers pass mitochondrial DNA to every new generation. We know it comes from exactly 16,529 base pairs. We know quite a bit about this. Studies show that one human mitochondrial DNA occurs every 6 generations. Mitochondrial DNA, once every 6 generations. One of the reasons for that is it doesn't have to reproduce. It doesn't have to merge with the men's. So it creates a great deal of stability, which leads to Genesis kinds. 6, since the error also gets passed down unchanged, you can follow ancestry through the DNA track, the mutations. So when you take the mitochondrial DNA from all major people groups, sorted by the error, it turns out that all of us came from one of 3 women. Right there. All of us. Secular science will tell you these 3 branches are chimpanzees, orangutans, and humanoids. We happen to believe it's Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And quite frankly, their wives. And so you can follow this around. The idea, though, is once they started looking at the trend of the number of DNA sequences between the nodes, it turns out with the current rate that somewhere between 2 and 8 nucleotide differences should have accumulated in the 9 generations from Adam to Noah, which we talked about earlier. Turns out, today in world populations, the distance is 8. The understanding of genetics is right on. He couldn't get published in the U.S. Mendel's Accountants is 7 volumes like this. Had to be published by Singapore Press. If you ever get a chance to meet Dr. Sanford, I recommend you have lunch with him. He's a terrible speaker. But he's brilliant, just brilliant. That DNA then allows us to track back to the families, and it's an amazing similarity to the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. So you can actually follow this through. So now when we start talking about the genealogies, genetic mutation rates, etc., it lines up pretty good. In the 4,365 years since Noah, we would expect to see 115 mitochondrial DNA mutations if we assume women get birth at an average age of 15 over the centuries. That's high for some centuries, low for others. We also observed that there were 8 differences in the 3 nodes from Adam to Noah. The most diverse human mitochondrial DNA on record is 123 differences. 115 is what's predicted. That's pretty close, right? It's like horseshoes. It's close. All right, so fossils. This happens to be a Paracephalus. It's arguably 75 million years old. That's what MYO means, by the way, million years old. Creationists don't even have that in our lexicon. But anyway, it turns out that the problem was this fossil had 3 extremely significant and insurmountable problems. The first was they've actually found unfossilized parts. Some of the fossils not fossilized. Some of the soft tissue. Then it turns out it has carbon-14, which means it can't be 75 million years old. Can't be, unless the specimen was contaminated. But the problem we have with that is it would be every fossil specimen, every diamond, every petrified wood. They all have carbon-14. It does not take millions of years to make a diamond. I can make a diamond in a plasma chamber in 2 hours. And you know what the difference between that diamond and the one you pay a lot of money for at the jewelry store? The jeweler has to buy a fluoroscope to tell the difference, because the artificial one is probably going to be more perfect. And the worst insult, it has red blood cells in it. So all of these things that they show us that are terribly, terribly old, look at the detail on this shrimp. This did not wait around millions of years to get petrified. This happened instantly. And look at this poor thing up here. Literally eating lunch. And I did show it. Down on the bottom. That thing is giving birth. It's an ichthyosaur. That's a baby coming out. This thing was literally giving birth when it got buried. So this is not about time, it's about an event and conditions. There's the frond I was showing you and the mortality plate with the fish. So I can go to any of these fossils. You can find exquisite detail. They almost inevitably contain carbon-14. They are simply not the age they say they are. Some of these plates, this one's from Morocco, is incredible. Those brittle stars up there, they had to be instantaneously buried. It's the only way you save that tissue. So, reasons to believe. Well, I think the Bible teaches it. And in general, I would tell you that's enough. But if I said that and stopped, everybody'd be kind of disappointed, right? So paleontology, polystrate fossils, DNA in ancient bacteria, human population statistics, carbon-14 in ancient fossils, coal and diamond, soft tissue blood vessels in dinosaur fossils, rapid burial of fossils worldwide, and the varves, which are essentially a measure of the intensity of the volcanic activity. And when we look at them, they're very different. Geology. So, when I was a young kid, Niagara Falls was 30 million years old. That's what they told us. The problem was some surveyors back in the 1600s, 1678, had the bad form to actually bury stakes up there. And so we know that that's where the falls was in 1678, 1764, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out that Niagara Falls is about 30 miles, and it's up here, it's between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. And in 12,000 years, Niagara Falls will be in Lake Erie. It is not millions of years old. The signs are gone. You won't find those signs anymore. They'll tell you Niagara Falls is about 12,000 years old. I think that's probably still too high, but it's way better than 30 million. These happen to be Arches National Monument. This is out in Utah. It looks like this, and it's a wide open plain. And what they say is erosion came down and carved this down, and the hard parts of the stone stayed up and the soft parts went away. Problem we have is they're missing about 35 trillion cubic tons of material. Where'd it go? When something erodes, it doesn't dissolve, it doesn't disappear, right? And so their explanation is poor at best, but that's what the landscape looks like. And those things, I mean, it's fantastic. It's beautiful. So it has 120 square miles. Where did the debris go? Grand Canyon is a very similar thing. 277 miles long, 1,900 and some change miles long, and you can see it an aerial view there. Where did the debris go? If this all happened at a little at a time, we don't have any problem with the flood. We think an enormous lake broke and took everything, and took it down to this Gulf of California. The reason that we're pretty sure it doesn't work now is the Gulf of California is at a higher elevation than the Colorado River in there. But that's not a problem if you put in trillions of cubic gallons of water at one time and God breaks the dam and the whole thing forms in days. The 3 Mile River from Mount St. Helens to Spirit Lake formed in a couple of days. All of it. It's a 1/80th scale of the Grand Canyon. Looks like this. So what we find is slate and limestone is always created by moving water. So wherever you see formations like this, large amounts of moving water. These are folded rocks. You may know that if you try to fold a rock, it breaks. Rocks don't fold. And so Andrew Snelling applied for a license to go on and collect rocks, take pictures, measures, all of that in the Grand Canyon, and the federal government stopped him. And their argument was viewpoint discrimination. They didn't like what he was going to publish. Like, you can't have folded rocks. Folded rocks happened because those rocks were extremely soft and were fashioned during the hardening process, which means young, for a whole host of reasons. So these folded rocks, they're on the top of the Himalayas. They're all over. You know that the clamshells found on the top of Himalayas are bigger than my arms. They're enormous. It's really an interesting story to hear somebody try to explain how they got up there. So as we try to age some of these things, you'll hear radiocarbon dating. And I hate to get a little technical, but you need to have an idea. Gamma radiation, or cosmic radiation, comes in, essentially hits a nitrogen. A nitrogen atom has 7 protons, 7 neutrons, right? Its atomic number is 14. You just add them up, and it has 14 electrons. That makes a stable nitrogen atom. Cosmic radiation comes in, throws a neutron in here. The neutron replaces the proton. Now I still have an atomic number of 14, but I have 6 protons and 8 neutrons. It is no longer nitrogen. Anything with 6 protons is going to act in one way, shape, or form like an isotope of carbon. So this is now carbon 14. It has 14 electrons because it still has an atomic number of 14, and the balance will do that. Now, those atoms, let's just say, for sake of argument, I had 1 million of them. And they don't come 1 million at a time. They come like 300 billion at a time. But let's just use 1 million. So I have 1 million atoms, and this has happened to them. Nature doesn't want to let them stay here. This is an unstable isotope, carbon-14. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. That means plus or minus 10 years. So that means that this molecule wants to go back to this. So it has to find itself a proton. It's got to kick that, there's a neutrino that bops off too, but it's got to kick that proton or get a new proton, and it'll kick the extra neutron out. That's what it'll do. So here's what carbon-14 dating is all about. The only thing carbon-14 can measure is the approximate amount of time since something that was organic stopped being alive. So carbon-14 is entirely related to the respiratory process. So in nature, there's a certain number of carbon-12 atoms. There's also a certain number of carbon-14, less than 1%. So there's very little carbon-14. But as you and I breathe, as the tree has respiration, as a fish has respiration, we absorb in our tissues the same ratio. As soon as we die, we stop taking in carbon-14. And the carbon-14 wants to revert back to the nitrogen. So when you measure it, it no longer is there. So since we know how fast it converts, we can count the atoms, literally, count the atoms, and figure out how long something has been dead. So first thing, you can't use it on granite. It had to have been alive. It had to have been organic. So it can't be used on anything other than something that was alive. A tree, you know, a fossil, well, now a fossil, that kind of thing. So the half-life, 5730. The end of the day, less than 1/10 of 1% of all the carbon atoms in the atmosphere or in the earth are carbon-14, not many. So here's what happens. Radioactive decay, essentially half-life, 5,730 years, half of that sample is going to go back to nitrogen. Another half, another half, another half. And this is why the gentleman back there said, look, 10,000 is really a reasonable number of years, and that's here. That's after 2 half-lives. That's a reasonable estimate. Being kind, we'll give them 8 half-lives, and it comes out here to about 60,000 years. But I don't care how you do it. You can't make the math say millions of years. Not even close. If it has carbon-14 in it, it is not old. So after 4 half-lives, we're looking for 2,000 per million atoms. You're looking for 2,000 atoms in a population of 1 million atoms. So radioisotope dating, it assumes a constant decay rate. No gain or loss of parent isotopes. Most of these are things you can't prove. And known amounts of the daughter element present at the start. So the problem that old earthers or anybody who looks at things in an old age way is their presence of carbon-14 in coal, the presence of carbon-14 in diamonds, and the presence of carbon-14 in all fossils. They did not used to find it because they didn't look for it. It wasn't supposed to be there. Why look for something not supposed to be there? There are hundreds of physical processes in the world, most of them, if you apply them, give you a young Earth. So here's some of them. Formation of river deltas, the Mississippi River. Where's the stuff? It can't be more than 5,000 years old. Just can't. Not enough material down at the end of the river for it, etc. The salt in the ocean, sediment on the seafloor. Turns out we should expect 70 times more salt than we see. So you can measure the salt that gets added, you can measure the salt that gets taken out. There just plain isn't enough salt in the ocean for the ocean to be old. Can't be. Unless something changed. But we think the last time anything changed kind of major was the flood. So sediment on the seafloor. We would expect it to be about 1,300 feet down there. And in most places it's less than 10. So there's not the continents dump into the ocean all day, every day, all the time. The ocean really doesn't have much of a mechanism to bring it back. It throws a little bit back on the beaches, and it loses a little bit from subduction, right, at the plate boundaries. Some of it will go under and it'll get reabsorbed into the Earth's material. But we have there's pretty good science that tells us how much is the add or the subtract on sea sediments, sea salt, etc. Here is the Grand Canyon, or not the Grand Canyon, I'm sorry, Spirit Lake. This is the canyon that was formed in 3 days. It's a 1/80th scale, and you'll notice those rock layers. A couple of interesting things about those rock layers. There's no erosion. Well, I thought there were supposed to be millions of years between each layer. Now, if you go to your backyard, if you go to the lake, and you look at the first 6 inches, wherever the surface is, you're going to find lots of things like to live there. Lots of things. In the ocean, in the earth. It's almost impossible to find layers with no, it's called turbidity, between the layers. It's just not possible. The other thing is, these are organized, these molecules, these things are organized by specific gravity. The only thing that organizes by specific gravity is when water moves large amounts of land. Everything will organize to its weight. That's what specific gravity means. So it'll organize by size of the particles, etc. These are uniform layers. Say what you want about them, but what you would expect if this was all natural and it was happening over millions of years, all these layers should be all jumbled up, all mixed up. They're not mixed up at all. By the way, you know what those layers are called? Non-conformity layers. They're called non-conformity layers because they don't fit their theory. They fit our theory, but they're called non-conformity layers. Particles arranged by specific gravity. Here's an excellent idea, and over there I just gave you an idea. If you took vegetable oil, water, dish soap, corn syrup, and honey, you'll find those items in water will separate. That's exactly what particles do in moving water. And most of the rock on the earth is sedimentary, which means it was laid down by rock once you get above the flood zone, the flood area. And this is an example of the turbidity. Wherever you go, you're going to find unbelievable amounts of activity. It looks like an ant farm under there. It looks like you got one of those. You can look in and watch them. That's what the surface looks like on the ocean and on the land. So here's a Cambrian flathead sandstone. You can see it's kind of organized. It's on top of something called the Precambrian granite schist. Well, it turns out this has no fossils in it. So we're pretty sure it's pre-flood. This has fossils in it. There are 13 layers between these two in the geologic column. This layer goes all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, across Europe and northern Africa. This layer goes over to Asia. So the point is these layers go all over the world, and they're not in that form, and they have all the signs of very fast water organizing the layers very quickly. And there's no erosion between the layers, etc. Zircon crystals. Zircon crystals come from cooling magma. That's volcano, lava. When they cool, they trap uranium and thorium. Those two elements are radioactive and will give off helium. It turns out helium, being the second lightest element and second most common element in the universe, doesn't like to stay. So you can't get helium to stay inside it, even a diamond lattice. It'll clear itself out. It'll clear itself out of Earth's atmosphere, clears itself out of any transaction. So any transaction that has an end product that includes helium, we usually lose it. Okay? So helium being the second lightest element, and it's a noble gas. It will not combine. Helium will not combine with any other element. Very selfish, don't you think? So it's supposed to quickly go away. So anything that has a zircon crystal with helium in it can't be older than 100,000 years. And this is like our carbon-14. It's probably 10,000, but you just try to be gracious about it. You're saying it's 30 million. No, it's not 30 million. If they said it was 10,000 or 100,000, might have to live with that, but not 30 million. The hotter the rocks, the faster the helium escapes. And helium is present in all samples at all depths and temperatures. So you go into any mine and you go down, helium is trapped in the zircon crystals. That means the zircon crystals were created almost instantaneously. Zircon crystals are found mostly in granite. When they're by themselves, they look something like this. They are really good fake jewelry. And under an electron microscope, it might look something like this. This is the helium escaping. This is what one looks like under an electron microscope. And it turns out there are all kinds of samples, but in general, we're finding samples that are supposed to be 1.5 billion years old, but they still have 58% of the original helium in it. Shouldn't be any. And then you can go out to the atmosphere. Here's the creation model, by the way. This is what the uniformitarian model says should happen. This was the creation model. When they went into these mines, that's what they found, the blue dots. Creation model's right. Doesn't make it young, just means the assumptions are right. They will do almost anything. They will come to any alternate explanation rather than admit that it might have something to do with God or God might have said something. I'll give you an example. Almost any of these places, you're going to find things that they can't explain. And there's things we can't explain either, but things they can't explain. And so they will come back very often. They'll be faced with the idea that they have to admit it's God, or they can concede to directed panspermia. The aliens did it. Oh, I kid you not. Very serious theory. And it's being pushed out there all the time. All the time. The aliens did it. So we have a whole series of proofs on that. I'd like to take you here, and we'll probably have to finish here. So one of the ways to debate is something called reductio ad absurdum. And this says, okay, let's say for sake of our conversation, you're right. The Big Bang happened, Earth is 4.6 billion years old, etc. Let's find out what happens when we use your assumptions and take them out to their logical conclusions. So this phrase literally means reduction to absurdity. So I'm going to take what you're saying and we're going to see where does that lead us. So spiral galaxies. It turns out there's something called the wind-up problem. Not our problem. It's the person who denies that God did this. Spiral galaxies rotate at different speeds on the inside and the outside. They cannot hold their spiral shapes for more than 6,000 to 10,000 years. Can't do it. Yet, there are probably trillions of spiral galaxies out there, some arguably 13.1 billion light years away, and they're perfect spirals. Not only that, just to add insult to injury, God made them bigger out there. They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be babies. Okay, so that's the wind-up problem. Being as generous as you can be, the wind-up problem creates an outer limit. Spiral galaxies cannot be older than 100 million years old. And the number is probably a tenth that. But again, when somebody says it's 15 billion years old, 100 million is a pretty big difference.
So what do they say then? What do they say then?
What can they say?
I know.
No, they don't really respond to those arguments very directly. The problem here isn't any one of these metrics. I'm going to take you through a half a dozen, and nothing flat here. So comets, short cycle comets cannot last more than 10,000 years. Comets are basically dirty snowballs. And every time they come in, they get chewed up by the sun. They get smaller and smaller and smaller. So the issue is, where are they coming from? Comets are arguably a vestige of the original formation of the disk for the solar system, so 4.6 billion years ago. So where are they coming from? We know where they're disappearing to. We watch them. We lose them. So they say they came from the Oort cloud. And I'll show you that in a minute. Short period comets have a life of about, let's say, an orbit of 200 years. There's a Hale-Bopp hitting Jupiter. So other mechanisms also destroy comets. This is the collision with Jupiter. And then comets in the Oort cloud. So here's the issue. The Oort cloud is arguably trillions of things that look like a miniature asteroid field. This is found outside of the trans-Neptunian objects. Pluto is one of those. It's way out there, this Oort cloud. And arguably, this Oort cloud has lots of collisions, and every once in a while, one of them, I don't know, explodes and becomes a comet and comes into us. The problem here, many scientific papers are written each year about the Oort cloud, its properties, its origin, its evolution, yet there's not a shred of direct observational evidence for its existence. Trillions of objects in every direction. You know who said that? Carl Sagan. And so you know what our guy said, Danny Faulkner? He said, since it cannot be detected, the Oort cloud is not a scientific concept. Right? This is not bad science, but non-science, masquerading as science. The existence of comets is good evidence that the solar system is only a few thousand years old. Planetary heat loss. Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune all lose heat at 2 to 3 times the energy. So they get energy from the sun. They get a little bit of energy from internal sources from when they were first created. And then this idea here is they're reflecting 2 to 3 times that. Well, you can only do that so long. I mean, put $1,000 in your bank account and then go ahead and spend $300 a month. See where you're at the end of a year, right? You got nothing left. And that's the problem with the planets. All of these out there, the big gas giants and the ice giants. So if you assume the same rate and conditions, the planets cannot be older than 10 million years old. They're probably, well, we think they're a lot younger than that, but that's not the point. If you just look at the energy differential between what they take in and what they give out, they can't be old. Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune all have ring systems, well-established ring systems, by the way. By the way, Jupiter has the biggest ring system, but Saturn, nope, not Jupiter, sorry, Saturn. Saturn also has the most moons now. Saturn has about 160 moons. They're finding lots and lots of them. But the point is, all of these have ring systems. All of the ring systems are deteriorating for different reasons. Some ring systems are small rocks, some are dust, some are ice. Saturn's all ice. Saturn has something called ring rain. The ice is literally being drawn by gravity into the planet, and it drives the planet's atmosphere crazy. It's the reason Saturn has 500-mile-an-hour winds all the time. So at the end of the day, Saturn's rings will disappear. Now, you won't see them tonight because they're oblique, right? They're on edge. But just wait. They'll come back early next year. The planet will tilt, and you'll start seeing the rings again. But eventually they're going to go away, period. Neptune has 13 rings. Uranus has 17. So these rings are disappearing. Now they no longer posit that the rings were made with the planet. Remember, they tell us all our planets are 4.6 billion years old in this solar system. But the rings can't be more than 400 million years old. So now the question is, how did 4 planets develop ring systems of different materials? Not only that, did you know Uranus rotates on its side? Its rings are opposite. Uranus doesn't rotate like the rest of them. Neither do a lot of the moons. So the rings can't be older than 400 million years. Remember, the planets are 4.6 billion years. So now they got to figure out, where did the rings come from? Why are they there? And they can't last more than 100 million years. Now, those numbers are all extremely generous. You've been kind of seeing the approach tonight. Faint-Young-Sung paradox. Basically, our sun should be 40% hotter than it is if what they're saying is true. And it's not. And so our sun, actually, the Earth was 59 degrees. I thought I had it on here somewhere. There it is. The average temperature over our millennia has been about 59. If they're right about the rate at which the sun is burning hydrogen, the average temperature on Earth be 28, which means we do an ice ball, an absolute ice ball. But all the record for life shows that Earth was warm. Also had an oxygen atmosphere, which an oxygen atmosphere, it's called a reducing atmosphere. It won't allow for the creation of proteins by itself. They have to be protected inside of cells, etc. The lunar recession rate. Turns out the moon is moving away from us about an inch a year. So just to make sure I get to this stuff, we do all kinds of measurements. And the point is that the moon in 1.4 billion years would be on the Earth. It's supposed to be 4.6 billion years old. It was made the same time we were. So it just can't be. Here's for some of you, a more visual look. Okay. So the idea is that there is proof after proof after proof that it's not old. Not old like they're saying. And remember, their theories, all of them, Big Bang, evolution, all of those theories that are designed to replace God, all require incredibly long periods of time. So the magnetic field is decaying at a known rate. We've got measurements since 1829. And it turns out that if we've been decaying at about 5% a century since 1845 when they started measuring, that if we took the current magnetic field and added that up, that our sun would have been a white dwarf, and basically the Earth would have melted. It couldn't be. So we have this problem that supposedly the field was 40% stronger in 1000 AD. That's back like William Hastings attacking England, right? 1066, wasn't it, the Battle of Hastings, I think. So recent records indicate that we have a net energy loss of 1.4% in the last 3 decades. So our magnetic shield is winding down, which suggests that the source of energy is like a battery. It's not being replenished. It's not being recharged. That is not the theory about where Earth gets it. There's an argument that we're like a magneto, right? We have a liquid core. Don't think so. Don't think so. This is the magnetic field. By the way, there are 3 fields. We have a gravitational field, an electric field, and a magnetic field. All 3 waves are part of light. When the first day God says, "Let there be light," all 3 of those fields were created, and 2 of them electricity and magnetism are on the same wave, like this. That's why it's called electromagnetism. So I have light bulbs made of bases of bismuth at the house. Bismuth is a strange metal in that it's diamagnetic. It will repel. And so because the electrons in the sixth shell spin the wrong direction, according to the way most metals work. As a result, I can suspend a bismuth light bulb by a magnetic field. In other words, it's truly suspended. But the real miracle is when you show the kids, and I can send an electric current. I don't need to plug it in. I don't need to do anything. I don't have to do anything. All I could do is send an electric current up there to light the light bulb. That's because light is an unbelievably elegant form of information. Just like DNA is to the biology world, light is to the physical world. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to save my last few minutes. I'm going to close out here. So this is about helium decay, and this is an interesting thing. If we're as old as they say, there's another thing that really doesn't make sense. If the universe that we measure is 74% hydrogen, 24% helium, how is it that the Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen? You'd think if we were part of the universe for that long, we might start looking like the universe. And you know what? We don't look very much like the Earth. So there's a bunch of other things here, but I really appreciate your time. I want to honor everybody's time, and I do have 2 hours more material. So.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yeah.